The air raid sirens wailed, a familiar mournful symphony over London's burning skyline. Factories churned, their output a testament to a nation's grim resolve, fueled by Churchill's defiant spirit. Yet, beneath the relentless bombing and the ceaseless industry, a quiet, radical experiment was unfolding in a forgotten corner of England, a secret that would challenge the very foundations of enemy ideology, making 200 German women POWs question everything they had been taught. It was late autumn 1941. The biting wind carried the acrid scent of coal smoke and distant explosions across the rolling hills of Wiltshire. The village of Little Puddlecombe, a cluster of ancient stone cottages nestled beside a meandering brook, seemed a world away from the nightly terror of the Blitz, yet its fate, and indeed the nation's, was inextricably linked to the war's grim realities. Every evening, the distant thrum of German bombers heading for Bristol's docks, or the aircraft factories of Filton, was a stark reminder of Britain's precarious position. The infrastructure, though resilient, was strained, rationing tightened its grip, and the constant threat of invasion hung heavy in the damp air. Britain was fighting for its very existence, facing an enemy whose ideological fervour seemed unshakable, whose propaganda machine had woven a narrative of racial superiority and unyielding might. Conventional methods of warfare, while crucial, were not enough to break the spirit of a nation indoctrinated from childhood. The strategic dilemma was clear: how to counter an enemy whose belief system was as formidable as its military hardware. The established military system, brilliant at logistics and defense, struggled with the psychological warfare required to dismantle such deeply ingrained convictions. The cost of this ideological stalemate was immeasurable, not just in lives lost on the battlefield, but in the enduring hatred that threatened to poison generations. Enter Dr. Eleanor Vance, a formidable woman of 48, a Cambridge-educated psychologist with a sharp mind and an even sharper wit, originally from a working-class family in Manchester. Alongside her was Captain Alistair Finch, a 32-year-old former history lecturer from Oxford, invalided out of active service after Dunkirk, whose quiet determination belied his academic background. They were joined by Mrs. Beatrice B. Higgins, a 60-year-old village matriarch whose practical wisdom and unwavering sense of community were her greatest assets. Their proposal, born from countless late-night discussions over weak tea and stale biscuits, was radical. To establish a re-education program for captured German women, not through force or overt propaganda, but through immersion in ordinary British life. They faced immediate skepticism from the War Office. "Nonsense, Vance. A waste of resources. These women are fanatics, brainwashed," barked General Sir Reginald Hastings, a man whose belief in the efficacy of bayonets far outstripped his understanding of the human psyche. "We need to win the war, not host tea parties for the enemy." The bureaucracy was a labyrinth of forms and regulations, each one designed to stifle innovation. Yet the devastating losses at sea, the relentless bombing of civilian targets, and the sheer tenacity of the enemy's belief system made the necessity undeniable. The conventional approaches were failing to break the enemy's ideological hold. After months of persistent lobbying, countless rejected proposals, and the quiet backing of a few forward-thinking individuals within the intelligence services, a small, dilapidated manor house on the outskirts of Little Puddlecombe was quietly requisitioned. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but refusing to try meant accepting that some beliefs were simply unbreakable. The journey, against all odds, was about to begin. The requisitioned manor, dubbed Puddlecombe House, was a draughty, crumbling edifice, its grandeur long faded, its windows rattling in the persistent Wiltshire winds. The project began under the most brutal of wartime conditions. Fuel was scarce, so the house was perpetually cold, its ancient fireplaces offering little comfort. Materials for repairs were almost non-existent. Broken panes were patched with cardboard, and leaky roofs were temporarily mended with tarpaulins scavenged from bombed-out factories. The small team, comprising Dr. Vance, Captain Finch, Mrs. Higgins, and a handful of local women volunteers, worked tirelessly, often for 16 or 18 hours a day, their hands raw from cleaning and preparing the house for its unusual occupants. The constant threat of air raids meant that even these domestic tasks were punctuated by the wail of sirens and the distant rumble of bombs, forcing them into the damp, cold cellar. Time was a relentless master. Each day that passed meant more lives lost on the battlefields and in the bombed cities, more resources consumed, and the war's end seemed perpetually out of reach. The challenges were manifold. Technological limitations meant that communication with London was often unreliable, relying on temperamental field telephones or slow, censored dispatches. Critical materials, from basic foodstuffs to medical supplies, were severely rationed, forcing Mrs. Higgins to become a master of improvisation, stretching meagre rations to feed both the staff and the incoming prisoners. The environmental challenges were equally taxing. Incessant rains turned the manor grounds into a muddy quagmire, and the extreme cold seeped into every bone. Human challenges were perhaps the most profound. The civilian population, though resilient, was weary. The constant strain of rationing, the nightly bombings, and the endless news of casualties took their toll. Organizational hurdles persisted, with skeptical officers from the local Home Guard occasionally questioning the wisdom of housing enemy personnel so close to a civilian population. Yet the protagonists pressed on, their resilience a quiet testament to the British spirit. Dr. Vance, despite her academic background, could be found scrubbing floors alongside Mrs. Higgins, her spectacles fogged with steam. Captain Finch, his limp a constant reminder of his own sacrifice, meticulously documented every interaction, his dry humor a thin veneer over his deep concern. Another day, another step closer to sanity, or perhaps madness, he'd quip, sharing a weak cup of tea with a volunteer. Personal sacrifices were commonplace, families were separated, relationships strained, and health deteriorated under the relentless pressure. The predominant themes of human resilience under extreme adversity, the importance of improvisation when resources failed, and the quiet, often unacknowledged human cost of innovation were evident daily. The project was a microcosm of the nation's struggle, a place where social classes blurred in the common cause. Initial operational phases were fraught with setbacks. A minor bombing raid on a nearby railway line caused a temporary power outage, halting all work. A critical delivery of blankets was diverted, leaving the first contingent of German women shivering in the unheated rooms. Errors were made, schedules interrupted, but the team adapted. They learned to work by candlelight during blackouts, to make do with approximate calculations when precise instruments were unavailable. Despite the seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the operation was progressing, a fragile seed of hope planted in the heart of a war-torn nation, though success was far from guaranteed. The turning point was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, yet it began to ripple through the rigid structures of the German High Command. Reports from their intelligence services, initially dismissed as anomalies, started to show a disturbing pattern. Captured German women, particularly those from the auxiliary services, were returning from British internment camps with a peculiar lack of ideological fervor. Their debriefings, intended to reinforce Nazi doctrine, instead revealed a growing internal conflict, a quiet questioning of the narratives they had been fed since childhood. Convoys that should have been easy targets were passing through British waters with unexpected ease, and the effectiveness of German propaganda leaflets dropped over Britain seemed to be waning in certain areas. The enemy perceived that something fundamental had changed, but their understanding was incomplete, clouded by an inability to accept that a seemingly simple, unconventional method could counter their presumed ideological superiority. The doctrine conflict was stark. German military philosophy, rooted in rigid hierarchy, and absolute obedience, struggled to comprehend an enemy that deliberately broke the rules of conventional psychological warfare. They expected overt propaganda, harsh treatment, or attempts at direct indoctrination. Instead, they encountered a quiet, almost domestic approach that defied their expectations. Their intelligence analysts, poring over fragmented reports, tried to dismiss the growing number of ideologically compromised women as isolated cases, exaggerations from nervous officers, or simply a temporary dip in morale. This arrogance, born of an unwavering belief in their own system's infallibility, blinded them to the unfolding reality. Obersturmführer Helga Schmidt, an intelligence officer tasked with assessing the loyalty of returning personnel, found herself increasingly perplexed. The women from Camp 27, the codename for Puddlecombe House, spoke not of torture or brainwashing, but of shared chores, community spirit, and the unexpected kindness of their captors. "They made us bake bread, Helga," one woman reported, her voice laced with confusion. "They shared their rations, even when they had so little themselves. They spoke of their children, their husbands at the front, just like us." Schmidt, a staunch party loyalist, struggled to reconcile these accounts with the official narrative of the decadent, weak British enemy. Her reports, detailing the growing ideological fissures, were often met with scorn or filed away as unsubstantiated. The first direct engagement where the operation's effectiveness became undeniably clear was not a battle, but a series of interrogations. A group of German women, captured after a failed U-boat operation, were brought to Puddlecombe House. Their initial defiance, their unwavering belief in the Führer, slowly began to erode under the relentless yet gentle exposure to ordinary British life. They saw the resilience of the villagers, the shared sacrifice, the quiet determination that transcended class and background. They witnessed the Blitz spirit, not as a propaganda slogan, but as a lived reality. The theory that human connection and shared humanity could dismantle ideological barriers became a devastating reality for a system that could not adapt. The enemy, though still largely ignorant of the specific methods, now understood they faced an unprecedented challenge, one that their rigid system was ill-equipped to counter. Yet they still could not fully grasp how it had been created. When the conflict finally ended in 1945, the true impact of the Puddlecombe House experiment began to be understood, albeit quietly and without fanfare. While impossible to quantify precisely, the subtle erosion of Nazi ideology among the 200 German women who passed through its doors undoubtedly contributed to the broader psychological weakening of the enemy. It was a victory won not with bombs or bullets, but with empathy and shared humanity. The climate was one of profound, if exhausted, relief. The celebration was contained, a quiet sigh of collective liberation, an existential relief that the seemingly endless struggle had at last concluded. The lasting consequences of the Puddlecombe experiment transcended the immediate military context. It offered a quiet yet powerful understanding of how wars could be won, not solely through material superiority, but through tactical innovation, creative improvisation, and the unwavering determination to appeal to the shared humanity of even the most indoctrinated. In the post-war national sphere, the project, though remaining largely secret, subtly influenced approaches to post-conflict reconciliation and rehabilitation. It demonstrated that collaboration between academic insight and grassroots community spirit could achieve unprecedented results, establishing a quiet standard that initiative and improvisation were as valuable as bureaucratic hierarchy in addressing complex human challenges. The protagonists' fates reflected the varied nature of wartime service. Dr. Eleanor Vance, her health somewhat broken by the relentless strain, returned to academia, her experiences at Puddlecombe House informing her later work on social psychology, though she rarely spoke of the project publicly. Captain Alistair Finch, his limp a permanent reminder of the war, continued his career as a historian, his understanding of human motivation profoundly shaped by his time in Little Puddlecombe. Mrs. Beatrice Higgins, the heart of the operation, returned to her quiet village life. Her only recognition, the deep gratitude of the local volunteers and the occasional knowing glance from Dr. Vance. For many years, the operation remained a footnote, a classified secret. It was only decades later, in the early 1980s, when a young historian, Dr. Evelyn Reed, stumbled upon a series of declassified documents hinting at a re-education program for female enemy personnel in Wiltshire. Her meticulous research, including interviews with the last surviving volunteers and a few of the German women who had passed through Puddlecombe House, brought the story to light. The operation was finally reintegrated into the national historical narrative as a primary example of innovation under extreme pressure, a testament to the British capacity for resilience and quiet ingenuity. The Puddlecombe experiment proved something fundamental about the human capacity to confront an apparently impossible challenge and emerge not just having survived, but having fostered a profound, if subtle, transformation. It showed how ordinary individuals, through extraordinary acts of quiet courage and empathy, could change history, and how a nation's resilience could become an enduring part of its identity.